Good afternoon. You're all awake. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here. My name is Mehdi Hasan. Pleasure to be at Georgetown for the new Bridge Initiative as the guest of someone whose work I've long admired, Professor John Esposito, and someone who's done a great deal of work combating Islamophobia, both in book form and in tweet form, my good friend Nathan Lean there at the back. So thank you for having me here in Georgetown and on such an esteemed panel as well. Anne gave a beautiful talk. I highly urge you to read her brilliant book. I echo her call for more halal trucks in the street. And permit me, Anne, I just want to make one correction, if I may. I don't think it's quite right to say that there was no violence or nothing happened after the Danish cartoons, because, of course, the cartoonist illustrators have had their lives threatened, have almost been killed, and are living under police protection, which is an outrage in a free society, no matter what you think of what they drew or wrote, which obviously, personally, I object to. But yes, here today to talk about Islamophobia, which is one of the drivers, in my view, of violent extremism in some ways. And forgive me if you've heard this before. It's a story I often tell whenever I'm asked to speak on this subject. It's for me, it's quite apt. The story about a man who's walking through, a journalist, a reporter who's walking through Central Park in New York one day when he sees a small boy being mauled by a savage dog in the corner. And before he can go to help or do something, he sees a passerby jump into the melee, drag the dog off the boy, fight the dog, kill the dog, save the boy. The reporter takes a picture on his iPhone, runs over and says, "Guy, you are lucky that I was here to see that. I've taken a picture of that. Amazing. We're going to put you on the front page of the New York paper tomorrow under the headline, 'Brave New Yorker saves small boy from mad dog.'" To which the man responds, "Well, I'm not a New Yorker." He says, "That's fine. The headline will read, 'American hero saves little boy from crazy animal.'" He says, "I'm not American either." He says, "Well, what are you?" He says, "I'm a graduate student from Pakistan." The next day, the headline reads, "Islamic fundamentalist illegal alien murders innocent American dog, links to Al-Qaeda being investigated." Now, obviously, that's not a true story and not a real headline. But the point is that it's not that far off from what could be a real headline, what could be a real story, because of the sheer level of Islamophobia, of anti-Muslim bigotry, of hostility towards and hysteria about Islam that we've seen in recent years in our media on both sides of the Atlantic. The sad fact is that both in my home country, the UK, in Europe, in the US, Canada, you can now say things about Muslims in public life that you could not say about any other minority group. As Britain's first Muslim cabinet minister, Baroness Varsi, said back in 2011, in a speech, she said Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry has become socially acceptable. In polite conversation, it's, quote, "passed the dinner table test." And as the award-winning former Daily Telegraph journalist and commentator Peter Oborne, who's a Christian, not a Muslim, like Varsi, a man of the right, not the left, as he correctly observed, over the decades, Britain has learned through ugly experience not to insult and discriminate against almost every other minority, blacks, Jews, homosexuals, Irish. For some reason, he says, Muslims are still seen as fair game. Fair game. You all surely must have noticed, for example, how Muslims in the media are always framed as the other. That's the first thing that hits you in the context of them and us. Them versus us. Us being the non-Muslims, the majority, the normal, non-violent ones. Them being the Muslims, the minority, the weird, violent ones. Look at the press in my own country, in the UK, where I've spent the past 15 years as a journalist before I moved to the United States a few weeks ago. Consider this headline in the Daily Express. One of the worst offenders, newspaper offenders, when it comes to Islamophobia. Muslims tell us how to run our schools. Those Muslims, our schools. The idea that Muslim children, Muslim parents, are as much part of the British school system, the British schools culture, as anyone else just isn't even considered, entertained in this headline. This is the othering of an entire group of people, plain and simple. Then there's this favorite of mine from the Daily Star newspaper. BBC puts Muslims before you. Before you, dear reader, because you couldn't possibly be a Muslim because Muslims don't read newspapers. By the way, that star front page, you probably can't see in the bottom right corner, it comes complete with a Muslim woman in a face veil sticking up 2 fingers at you. How dare they? And it isn't just the famous British tabloid press that does this kind of stuff. How about this? Times of London front page from January of last year. Rise in Muslim birth rate as families feel British. The opening sentence to the piece reads, almost 1/10 of babies and toddlers in England and Wales are now Muslim. Oh my God, the Muslim babies are coming. That's the Times. I haven't got a slide for the next one because it was just yesterday as I was preparing this talk in the Daily Telegraph, which is Britain's biggest selling broadsheet conservative newspaper, closely aligned with the Conservative-led government in the UK. It ran a headline, "The price that Ed Miliband is prepared to pay to win the Muslim vote," which claimed Muslim pedophiles and criminals would be the only ones celebrating the Labour Party's plans to bring in anti-Islamophobia legislation if it wins the next election. But it's not just the press hostility, bias, alarmism that should bother us. It goes much beyond the negative and hysterical tone of much of the coverage of Islam and Muslims in the Western media. It's the brazen, outright dishonesty. You can now not just say things about Muslims that you wouldn't say about other people, you can make stuff up about Muslims that you wouldn't dare make up as a journalist or a commentator about any other group. Again, my examples are from the British press, but they apply equally to the US media. Did a local council in South London, for example, ban Christmas to avoid offending Muslims? No. Did NatWest Bank remove its piggy banks to avoid offending Muslims? No. Did a local council in the town of Rochdale bring in Muslim-only public toilets? No. Did Muslims cause transport chaos during the London Olympics of 2012? No. Did Muslim doctors put patients at risk by disobeying hygiene rules? No. Did a Muslim bus driver ask his passengers to get off his bus so he could pray to Allah in the middle of the road? Actually, no. And the Sun actually had to pay out damages for once to this poor bus driver for these nonsensical claims. As my good friend Jonathan Friedland, executive comment editor of The Guardian, columnist for the Jewish Chronicle, as he wrote in 2006, at the height of the British media frenzy over the face veil, over the niqab, he wrote, "I try to imagine how I would feel if this rainstorm of headlines substituted the word Jew for Muslims. Jews creating apartheid, Jews whose strange customs and costumes should be banned. I wouldn't just feel frightened," he wrote, "I would be looking for my passport." And this isn't just anecdotal or opinion-driven. The empirical evidence on the press and its almost institutionally Islamophobic coverage is pretty clear and well documented. In 2008, for example, and I know Roland's going to enlighten us in a much greater detail than me, but a few years ago, in 2008, when I worked at Channel 4, we commissioned Cardiff University School of Journalism to carry out a study of almost 1,000 articles written between 2000 and 2008 on the subject of Islam or Muslims. The Cardiff researchers found that over 2/3 of the stories published in that 8-year period identified Muslims either as a source of problems or as a threat. More than 1 in 4 stories suggested Islam was dangerous, backward, or irrational. The Cardiff researchers also found, surprise, surprise, that the most common adjectives used in relation to Muslims were, wait for it, radical, fanatical, fundamentalist, extremist, militant, while references to radical Muslims outnumbered references to moderate Muslims by a whopping 17-1 in that time period. Crossing over the Atlantic, academic studies, anecdotal evidence suggests the same. Here in the US, Islamophobia went mainstream long ago. And when I say mainstream, I'm not just referring to Fox News, which is a pantomime villain in many ways, with its various hosts and pundits who have compared Islam to the Antichrist, compared Muslims to Nazis, compared the Quran to Mein Kampf, claimed every terrorist as a Muslim, demanded that young Muslim men at airports be strip searched. I'm not just referring to the inane coverage that we get from Fox News, but also to quote unquote the mainstream media, the liberal media. I'm referring, for example, to the recent New York Times column by Roger Cohen, for example, which was headlined "Islam and the West at War." Or the Atlantic Monthly's essay-length claim that ISIS is, quote, very Islamic. To the CNN host who demanded to know whether his Muslim human rights lawyer guest supported ISIS or not. To HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, which featured a five-man panel discussion on Islam last October, which had no Muslims on the panel, and on which self-styled liberals Bill Maher and Sam Harris referred to Islam as, quote, the mafia and as the motherlode of bad ideas. Again, this isn't just anecdotal. A recent study by University of Illinois professor Travis Dixon of US TV and cable news between 2008 and 2012 found, surprise, surprise, a disproportionate and blatant overrepresentation of Muslims as terrorists, as criminals, as violent. So what are the big takeaways from all this? I want to make 6 quick points before I finish, 3 of which are to do with tackling myths, and 3 of which are to do with clearly identifying dangerous trends in front of us. First, we have to tackle this myth, and if the Bridge Initiative is going to be a success, I hope it can lead on this. We have to tackle this myth that Islamophobia itself is a myth. Unlike anti-Semitism, where people simply argue over whether someone or something is anti-Semitic or not. With Islamophobia, you have to jump over a first hurdle, which is to establish whether it even exists as a phenomenon or concept, because there are those who say it doesn't exist, it's made up, it's a propaganda phrase to protect Islam from criticism. So with Islamophobia, first you have to win the argument that it even exists before you can even condemn or accuse someone of engaging in it. And it's ironic that the same people who very flippantly claim, oh, it's inaccurate to label anti-Muslim bigotry as a phobia because it's not an irrational hatred, you can't use the word phobia, are the same people who have no problem calling anti-gay bigotry a phobia, homophobia, or anti-Semitism, which of course refers to Semites, not Jews, but we know what it means. So Islamophobia is not the most ideal of concepts, linguistically speaking, but it's the best we have. And we can't hide behind this idea that, oh, the phenomenon itself needs to be better identified. Second, we have to tackle this myth that Islamophobia isn't a form of racism because Islam isn't a race, which I call the Richard Dawkins defense of bigotry. Forgive me for pointing out that the Muslim minority in the West tends to be overwhelmingly non-white, not to mention politically and economically marginalized. And when someone like, say, Sam Harris says we need to profile Muslims or, quote, anyone who looks like he or she could conceivably be Muslim, it's pretty clear what he's referring to, and it isn't the ideas in that person's head. Third, there's this myth pushed by journalists that the only reason the media focuses on Muslims is because of the terror threat from Muslims. Don't blame us for covering you. It's because of all the bombs going off. What else are we supposed to do? It's a superficially appealing argument, but it doesn't take into account, A, the fact that a lot of Islamophobia predates the 9/11 attacks, predates 2001. This didn't begin on the morning of September 12th, 2001. Go back and look at the literature, look at the evidence, look at what was being said about Muslims, about Arabs in the 1990s, in the US, in the UK, from the end of the Cold War. And of course, B, it doesn't take into account this argument about terrorism, the fact that media fear-mongering on non-terror-related Muslim issues is at all-time highs. It isn't just violence and terrorism that's under scrutiny or that's always raised. You have this obsession with all Muslim issues, which are fear-mongered about, whether it's creeping Sharia law in Oklahoma, where they have a ballot, where there's more people who are probably Jedi Knights than are Muslims in Oklahoma, but they have ballot initiatives to ban Sharia law, or the wearing of the headscarf. Yesterday in France, there was a great story about a girl who was asked to leave school, not because she was wearing a headscarf, she took the headscarf off, because her skirt was too long. That was deemed a religious symbol and a threat to the French state, so she was asked to leave school. Or you have, of course, the recent hysteria over halal meat, which is, Britain goes halal. Apparently halal meat is everywhere. Now, even if that were true, sadly, as a Muslim, it's not. It's hard to find halal meat, even today. But even if it were true, let's not hide behind the violence argument. The halal chicken on your pizza is not going to blow you up. Let's be very clear. This is not a terror argument or a terror issue. Fourth, we have to identify and challenge the groups behind Islamophobia. A lot of this stuff isn't spontaneous or accidental bigotry. It's well-funded, well-coordinated. It's very deliberate. It's pushed out, as Nathan says in the title to his book, by an Islamophobia industry, an Islamophobia network documented by, among others, the Center for American Progress's Fear Inc. landmark report in 2011, as well as by a more recent report by sociologist Professor Christopher Bale of the University of North Carolina. We have to call out these groups, these networks. We have to call them out, identify them. Fifth, we have to identify the real-world consequences of widespread media Islamophobia on both sides of the Atlantic. To pretend, ladies and gentlemen, that this relentlessly negative, hostile, fear-mongering coverage of a marginalized minority community has no effect on community relations or on integration is naive, if not disingenuous. Portraying Muslims as different or dangerous has serious repercussions, from bomb attacks or arson attacks on mosques in Europe, to headscarf-clad Muslim women being assaulted or spat at in the streets, to Muslim children being bullied in school. It leads to Muslims in the West, educated, integrated Muslims, feeling further alienated from the mainstream, further disillusioned with the mainstream, looking, in Jonathan Friedland's words, for their passports. Finally, we have to clearly identify the way in which Islamophobia in our press and on our TV screens and online isn't just morally wrong, it's dangerous and counterproductive too. It doesn't just increase feelings of alienation, it makes the extremist, the jihadist narrative about a clash between Islam and the West, it makes that much more appealing to angry, to bitter, to marginalized young Muslims living in the West. Politicians, security agencies, terrorism experts constantly talk about the need to win hearts and minds. Well, in my experience, in my view, nothing does more to lose hearts and minds, Muslim hearts and minds, than the incessant, relentless, negative headlines, disparaging generalizations, lazy stereotypes, and made-up fictitious stories that we see about Islam and Muslims in the press, on our television screens. It has to change, it has to stop, and you know what? At a values level, it's un-British, it's un-American, it goes against all of those values of fairness, decency, honesty, equality, tolerance, mutual respect, all of those values that are supposed to make us in the West civilized and enlightened, as opposed to our supposedly barbarian and backward enemies in the East. Our media, ladies and gentlemen, can be better than this. We can be better than this. Thank you very much for your time.